as the sheets are going out, just let me say that I like this sheet as a mechanism because it gives me a way of trying to streamline what I'm going to say to where I only talk about the bare essentials, and we can keep this thing moving and hopefully keep it brief. However, if you need a 350-page explanation, I just defended one of those the other night, and it'll be in the GTU library sooner or later. So that's coming. My immediate plans are to make the revisions to my dissertation, and then I'm going to Wisconsin for a month. There's this small town of Dallas, Wisconsin, population of 350 people. It's where my grandma grew up. I've been going there summers since I was a little boy. This year I'm going in the fall. But on the 3rd of October, they're having the Oktoberfest, and there's going to be a 165-foot brat made from Louis' Fine Meats in Cumberland, Wisconsin. So I figured, you know, I've got the dissertation done. I might as well go and enjoy a 165-foot brat. Okay, now that the sheets are handed out, the genesis for my work came in the 1990s. I remember reading a book by Friedhof Capra, and that book was entitled The Tao of Physics. And Capra was making the case that the Eastern religions provided the best ontological and epistemological bases to account for the developments in modern physics, such as quantum mechanics, relativity. And he was making the case that, you know, the monotheistic traditions, and particularly Christianity, just kind of had this monistic view of God, and it was kind of static, but the Eastern religions were dynamic and relational. And I got to thinking, well, wait a minute, the Trinity's dynamic and relational. I'd like to respond to Capra from a Trinitarian perspective. And so I tried, but I did not have the scholarly maturity to pull this off. So I came to the GTU knowing what I wanted to do. I wanted to make this my dissertation project. And one of the things I noticed when I got into it was there just isn't the attention to science from the Buddhist perspective as you see from the Christian perspective. And there's a good reason for that, because Buddhism was not systematically attacked by science, and it hasn't been engaging it for quite as long. So the first thing was, okay, there's not a lot of material. And then the next disappointment was some of the material is a very popularized discussion based on strained analogies where they take scientific theories out of context and doctrine out of context, and they say, see, they're the same or they're similar. And then, so I've got not very much material, and some of what I have is based on strained analogies, and then the good stuff is actually dealing with a different focus than Christianity deals with. And that is because Buddhism and Christianity have different dialogues with the sciences, and that's related to their different systems. You see, with Christianity, you have the doctrine of creation, and that throws the emphasis naturally onto the natural sciences. But Buddhism is concerned with personal liberation, and so that throws the emphasis onto the mental sciences. So I want to write this thing, and the problem is I don't have a lot of material coming from the Buddhist side. Some of what's there isn't good, and the stuff that's good is not what I'm wanting to focus on. So what is a good central topic that both sides can agree on? That brings us down to the next major section. Epistemology is the central topic. And there's a couple good reasons for choosing epistemology. One of which is that it's common to both Buddhism and Christianity. The other thing is epistemology gets into the philosophical core of science. It gets away from theories which are here today and gone tomorrow, and gets away from the problem of taking theories out of context, and it gets to something that is more unchanging, like scientific method. And so if you base a comparison on that, you have a comparison that doesn't become obsolete when the theory changes. So I focused on that, and then there's another problem. And the problem is this. In the West, since Descartes, the subject-object problem has actually become a problem. It wasn't a problem in the Middle Ages, but it has become a problem. And so a lot of the discussion since Descartes has been trying to shore up everyday knowledge, scientific knowledge, what Buddhists would call conventional knowledge. But Buddhists didn't have Descartes. And so they didn't have that problem. And so you look through this and you say, oh, they're not interested in that so much. Subject-object works just fine. Their interest is moving beyond conventional knowledge to ultimate knowledge. So again, there's a difference in the problematic. There's a difference in the emphasis. And so what I did was I went down to the basis of epistemology, if you will, the ontology of epistemology, and I looked at something called the one in the many problem as the basis for knowledge. I'll explain that in a minute, but that's the reason my dissertation is entitled The One, the Many, and the Philosophy of Science. So, what is this one and many problem? It is a classical philosophical problem. How can the many things somehow be one? And how can unity have diversity in it? And it's not just an ontological problem, it's an epistemological problem, because our knowledge also has the issue of unity and diversity. We see that with the objects of knowledge, and we see that with the subject-object relation. If we look at the objects of knowledge, let's say we're talking about zebras. You'd say, okay, there's a whole bunch of individual zebras, and yet they're all zebras. How can they be many and one? Or if you talk about an equation in physics, force equals mass times acceleration, you have a whole bunch of data points, a manyness that is unified by a single relation. So you have a one and many problem. Also, there is a diversity between the subject and the object of knowledge. The subject and object are distinct, so they are many, or two in this case, and yet they're also one in the sense that there's a connection. So you have the related problem of distinction and relation between the subject and object, and that's why I believe that monism and pluralism both fail to account for knowledge, because neither one of those systems has the combination of distinction and relation. If you look at a monistic system, you don't have difference. And so you don't have a distinction between subject and object. You don't have a distinction between objects. Knowledge vanishes. In a pluralistic system, knowledge also vanishes, but for the opposite reasons. There you do not have connections between the objects or between subject and object. So that much sets the basis, the theoretical basis for this thing, and now I want to shift gears and talk about the comparative nuts and bolts of this project. I focused on Buddhism as an Eastern religion because that's what was available at the GTU at the time, and that was providential because that was enough to focus on. And also, there's a nice center here, the Institute for Buddhist Studies. I took 24 courses there in Buddhist studies. I really wanted to do this right. As a Christian, I do not want to bear false witness against someone else's tradition. So I compared Trinitarian theology with three forms of Buddhist philosophy, and I chose these because these three have been active in the religion and science dialogue at various times in history. Those three are Theravada Buddhism, Zen, and Tibetan Buddhism. Theravada, its philosophical system is called Abhidhamma, and a very rough thumbnail sketch is its basically reality is reduced to events, kind of like Whitehead, but not exactly, but that gives you an idea. Zen is interesting. It claims not to be philosophical. It claims to avoid explicit doctrinal statements, and yet, if you look at its history, you see that the early Zen patriarchs, or Chan as it's known in China, they were influenced by a type of a Chinese Buddhist synthesis called Huayan Buddhism, and that brought together the three major strains of Indian Mahayana Buddhism, namely Madhyamaka, Yogacara, and Tathagata-garbha, and it brought them together into a synthesis, and that's what influences Zen. And then Tibet has four schools. They base themselves on the Madhyamaka philosophy of the Indian philosopher named Nagarjuna. And these schools, basically you've got the Gelugpa interpretation, that's the school that the Dalai Lama is associated with, and then the other three schools have a similar, more of a hierarchical view. I don't want to get off on that at this point. So having the other thing about this is the geographical area. It's just interesting. Theravada Buddhism, Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, with the exception of Vietnam, because Vietnam is in the Chinese cultural sphere. East Asian Buddhism, that's the Chinese cultural sphere, so you've got China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. So Zen is a representative of East Asian Buddhism. And then Tibetan Buddhism, you have Tibet, Mongolia, Nepal. Having chosen these traditions to compare with Trinitarian theology, I had to develop a comparative framework. And so what I did was I used Francis Clooney's comparative theology, and I put that together with Bob Russell's creative mutual interaction. And I really like that method because Bob talks about 5 ways that science influences theology and 3 ways that theology influences science. And so we have 8 pathways, and each one of those pathways becomes a locus for comparative studies between any 2 religions, actually. And so just to give you a couple of examples, because I can't do all 8, one of the ways that science influences theology is as a constraint. It puts out data that theology must be able to assimilate if it is to remain credible. So we could compare 2 systems, say, on their ability or lack thereof to assimilate certain types of data. One of the ways that theology influences science is to provide philosophical assumptions that are necessary for science. That's the pathway I chose in this dissertation, and it says, okay, which system provides is able better to account for scientific method? So, having done that, I next need a standard of comparison, and that is scientific method. So what I did was I looked at the post-positivist philosophy of science, and we're looking at people like Popper and Quine and Hansen and Kuhn, Lakatos, Bloor. And what I discovered was that in all these cases, there was this methodological invariant called the Peircean triadic circuit. And Peirce says that science, its method goes by a circuit: abduction, deduction, induction. And the way he defines it is abduction is this conceptual gestalt where you form the hypothesis. And then deduction, you work out the implications of your hypothesis. Induction, you compare it to data. And if that isn't right, you start over again until you get a successful loop. And so the question became, well, after that, that's the standard. So the question then is, which of these traditions best accounts for the Peircean triadic circuit? The next thing I had to do was to provide philosophical expositions of each of the 4 traditions, the 3 Buddhist traditions and Trinitarian theology, and in order to make them commensurable and comparable. And then finally, I compared them to the benchmark of the Peircean triadic circuit, and it is which tradition can best handle the one and the many problem in order to ground the Peircean triadic circuit as the basis of scientific method. My results. First of all, the Trinity provides an ontological basis for knowledge because it is both one and many. God is eternally one, and God is eternally 3. His oneness is not derived from his 3ness, nor his 3ness from his oneness. God's oneness and 3ness, or oneness and manyness, are co-eternal, equally ultimate, and mutually conditioning. And therefore, the Trinity provides a basis in which you can have unity and diversity. By contrast, Theravada Abhidhamma is a pluralistic system, and it fails to account for the unity of knowledge. The interesting thing is the other 2 traditions, Zen Buddhism and Tibetan Madhyamaka, and this is where I was surprised, because they have, if the Trinity has a both-and approach to the one and the many problem, these traditions have a neither-nor approach. And it's interesting because oneness and manyness dialectically negate each other to maintain a middle path between monism and pluralism. And that's why they can't be written off. I mentioned before that the monist and pluralist alternatives fail. But this is a middle path going between them. And it's almost a middle path between success and failure, because it doesn't positively establish the Persian circuit, but it doesn't destroy it either. It's almost like it operates by a double negation. Inasmuch as diversity tends to split the operations apart into pluralism, it is negated by unity. Inasmuch as unity attempts to suffocate the differences, it is negated by plurality. Accordingly, in this system, scientific knowledge is not established or destroyed, but it emerges as a de facto reality. Finally, the significance. The CTNS uses the Golden Gate Bridge as a metaphor for their work in bridging religion and science. I have extended this bridge by bridging the interreligious dialogue into the religion and science discussion. My comparative framework provides a systematic basis for an academic research program in which varying aspects of a comparison can be parceled out and then combined to make a more complete picture. Another thing, because my research deals with the philosophical core of science, it brings the philosophical cores of Christianity and Buddhism into play in such a way that they can be seen. And I really believe that this is significant for our situation in a scientific postmodern West, where it is post-Christian and secular, and yet people are craving new modes of spirituality. Thank you. I'll take some questions.
Yes, we'll have an opportunity later, but how about a quick question right now for John?
I was fascinated by your presentation, and the topic was so inspiring to me, because we were in the same class in Arena,
Mm-hmm.
and we learned together. So I was so happy to see you include Buddhist philosophical source in your dissertation. And while I was listening to your presentation, I was a little confused that what you trying to mean by the distinction of one and many, and you take an analogy of zebra, and zebra one, and there's a lot of one species and a lot of members, and you take it as an analogy, and and you also told us that one and many, the problem of one and many is kind of epistemological issue. But the analogy of zebra seems to me that it is, you take it as a kind of ontological problem, because there's one species and there are many other members in the class of zebra. So I'm asking to clarify a little bit of this division of one and many in terms of epistemological characteristic, such as in Majamaka also they were dealing with the one and many problem, but I also but as far as I understand, there is a kind of a hermeneutical problem in such as that how the same subject and object problem, but how is one subject interpreted as many, or as interpreted as having multiple meanings, one object, but many subjective meanings. So that's the main struggle for the Majamkas, and their philosophical answer is a kind of very inspiring to many Mahayana Buddhists.
I'm not quite sure what you're asking, but let me look at a couple of things. I offered the example of the zebras, and I offered the example of force equals mass times acceleration. It's one relation covering many data points. I think the one in the many problem manifests itself in a variety of spheres and in a variety of ways. I'm just trying to illustrate it as briefly and simply as I can in a public presentation. With regard to Nagarjuna, it seems to me, as I read that, you were talking about subject and object, that a Majjhimaka approach would say they're not the same and they're not different. It's a neither nor approach because they're relationally interdependent and therefore insubstantial. Go ahead.
I wonder if you had any reflection on the issue of meaning in both the Trinitarian philosophical approach and, let's say, Zen Buddhism. Because the question of meaning is essentially meaningless within Zen.
I didn't reflect on that. I was focused on providing a philosophical exposition in terms of where Zen stood on the one and many problem and whether it could account for science. I wouldn't, off the top of my head, quite know how to deal. What does meaning mean? That's the first thing I'd have to figure out.
Well, it's a question of purposelessness in creation. In other words, in Zen, in fact, in most Oriental thought, the question of meaning to existence is meaningless. Whereas in Christianity, it's the very foundation of the question. I mean, the very foundation of the monotheistic Western religions is to answer the question of meaning, the question of meaning of existence. In Oriental thought, particularly in Zen thought, the issue is the question of perception, and it is to change the nature of your perception. Once you achieve that, then the question of meaning becomes meaningless.
Mm-hmm.
So all I'm asking is whether you wrestled with that conundrum in your trying to create a relational context of these two theological systems.
I don't know that I dealt with that directly, but I probably did indirectly. As I was finishing this project, I noticed that I was using scientific knowledge as the metric by which to compare them. And I thought to myself, that's great for a modern era, but we're in a different era now. Maybe a better metric would be something like love, or you talk about meaning or personality, something that more people can relate to, because the average person on the street isn't really concerned that a metaphysical system provides a basis for scientific knowledge, but he or she is concerned about love, meaning, things like that. So I guess I would say that if I had done what you're suggesting, it could have a wider impact and be more accessible to folks.